There's a curious phenomenon that occurs in human consciousness. We believe we know ourselves. We believe that the person we present to the world is who we actually are, that our thoughts and feelings and behaviors arise from a genuine, authentic core. We look in the mirror and see ourselves clearly. We explain our actions with confidence. We describe our character with certainty. And yet, if we observe closely, if we pay attention to the discrepancies between what we believe about ourselves and how we actually behave, we begin to notice something troubling. There is a gap. There's a difference between who we think we are and who we actually are in the world. This gap exists because we are wearing a mask, a psychological construct that mediates between our inner reality and the outer world. And the most dangerous thing about this mask is not that we wear it. The most dangerous thing is that we do not know we are wearing it. We have identified with it so completely that we believe the mask is our face. We have confused the role we play with our actual being. And this confusion creates a split in the psyche, a division that prevents us from living authentically and that generates suffering we cannot understand because we do not see its source. When we speak of the mask in depth psychology, we use the term persona. The word comes from the Latin, referring to the masks worn by actors in classical theater. These masks indicated which character the actor was playing, which role they were embodying. And this is precisely what the psychological persona does. It is the role we play in the social world, the character we perform, the face we show to others. It is composed of all the ways we have learned to present ourselves in order to be accepted, to be successful, to be safe. The persona is necessary. We cannot function in society without some degree of adaptation. We cannot expose every aspect of our inner world in every situation. We learn to be professional at work, to be polite with strangers, to be appropriate in different contexts. We develop different personas for different roles: the competent professional, the loving parent, the loyal friend, the dutiful child. This is normal and healthy. The problem arises not from having a persona, but from identifying with it completely, from believing that the mask is the self. This identification happens gradually and unconsciously. It begins in childhood, when we learn which aspects of ourselves are welcomed and which are rejected. The child discovers that certain behaviors bring approval and love, while others bring punishment or abandonment. And because the child is utterly dependent on the caregivers for survival, they adapt. They learn to emphasize the acceptable parts and suppress the unacceptable parts. They begin to construct a persona, a version of themselves that will ensure connection and safety. Perhaps the child is naturally boisterous and energetic, but the parents are overwhelmed and need quiet. The child learns to be calm, restrained, considerate. The natural energy goes underground, and in its place appears a persona of composure and self-control. Perhaps the child is sensitive and emotional, but the family culture values stoicism and strength. The child learns to hide their feelings, to present a tough exterior, to never show vulnerability. The sensitivity goes into the shadow, and the persona of toughness takes its place. Perhaps the child is intelligent and questioning, but the family requires obedience and conformity. The child learns to keep their thoughts to themselves, to go along with what is expected, to not make waves. The critical intelligence is suppressed, and a persona of compliance emerges. In each case, the child is doing what is necessary to survive, to maintain the connection that they depend upon. But in doing so, they are splitting themselves, dividing into an acceptable self that is shown and an unacceptable self that is hidden. As the child grows into an adult, this pattern continues and deepens. The persona becomes more elaborate, more sophisticated, more convincing. The person develops a self-concept, a narrative about who they are, based on the persona rather than on their actual totality. They might say, "I am a rational person, I do not let emotions control me." Or, "I am a generous person, I always put others first." Or, "I am an easygoing person, nothing really bothers me." These self-concepts feel true because they are reinforced by the persona, by the consistent way the person presents themselves to the world. But beneath the persona, in the unconscious, everything that has been rejected is still present. The rational person who claims not to be emotional has feelings they cannot acknowledge. The generous person who always puts others first has needs and desires they cannot express. The easygoing person who claims nothing bothers them has anger and frustration they cannot feel. All of this rejected material forms the shadow, the dark double of the persona, the repository of everything we are that does not fit the image we have constructed. Now, here is where the danger lies. When we identify completely with the persona, we lose access to the shadow. We lose access to parts of ourselves that are essential to wholeness. We become one-dimensional, rigid, unable to adapt to situations that require qualities we have disowned. The rational person cannot connect emotionally. The generous person cannot set boundaries. The easygoing person cannot stand up for themselves. They are imprisoned by their own persona, limited to the narrow range of behaviors that the mask allows. And there is another consequence, perhaps even more insidious. When we identify with the persona, we project the shadow onto others. We see in other people the qualities we have denied in ourselves. The rational person is disturbed by emotional people, seeing them as weak or out of control. The generous person resents selfish people, seeing them as morally inferior. The easygoing person is irritated by confrontational people, seeing them as aggressive or difficult. But these projections are not accurate perceptions of others. They are encounters with our own shadow, disguised as judgments of other people. Let me give you a concrete example. Consider a woman who has constructed a persona around being helpful, nurturing, always available to others. She prides herself on her selflessness, on her capacity to care for everyone around her. This persona developed in childhood, perhaps in response to a family system where she had to take care of others emotionally because the adults were unavailable. She learned that her value lay in being needed, in being the caretaker, and this became her identity. As an adult, she continues this pattern. She is the friend everyone calls in crisis. She is the employee who takes on extra work. She is the partner who accommodates all needs. She never says no. She never expresses her own needs. She has convinced herself that she does not have needs, that she is simply a giving person by nature. This is her persona, and she believes it is who she truly is. But beneath this persona, in the shadow, there is the part of her that is exhausted from constant giving, that resents being taken for granted, that longs to be cared for rather than always being the caregiver. There is the part that wants to be selfish sometimes, to prioritize her own desires, to let others handle their own problems. But this part is completely unacceptable to her conscious self-concept. She cannot acknowledge these feelings without threatening her entire identity. So they remain in the shadow, unconscious and unintegrated. And these shadow feelings begin to leak out in indirect ways. She develops physical symptoms, chronic fatigue or illness that forces her to withdraw. She becomes passive-aggressive, agreeing to help but then forgetting or doing things half-heartedly. She becomes resentful, though. She would never admit it, and this resentment poisons her relationships. She projects her shadow onto others, becoming critical of people she perceives as selfish, as not caring enough, as not doing their share. She sees her own disowned selfishness reflected in them, and she judges it harshly. Eventually, if the split between persona and shadow becomes too extreme, there may be a breakdown. Perhaps she has a crisis where she can no longer maintain the helpful persona. Perhaps she becomes so depleted that she cannot function. Perhaps she does something that shocks everyone who knows her, something that contradicts everything they believed about her character. This is the shadow erupting, breaking through the persona, demanding to be acknowledged. And in this crisis, there is the possibility of awakening, of recognizing that the persona is not the self, that she has been living a partial life based on a constructed image rather than on her actual totality. Or consider a man who has constructed a persona around being strong, independent, self-sufficient. He prides himself on never needing anyone, on handling everything himself, on being the one others lean on, but who never leans on anyone else. This persona may have developed in response to early experiences where vulnerability was met with rejection or ridicule, where showing weakness led to being hurt. He learned to hide his needs, to rely only on himself, to present an image of unshakable strength. And this persona serves him well in certain contexts. He is successful professionally because he is seen as capable and reliable. He is respected by others who admire his apparent self-sufficiency. But beneath the persona, in the shadow, there is the part of him that is lonely, that longs for connection, that needs support and care. There's the part that is vulnerable, uncertain, afraid. But these qualities are completely incompatible with his persona, so they remain unconscious, and this split creates suffering. He is unable to form deep, intimate relationships because intimacy requires vulnerability, requires showing the parts of himself he has learned to hide. He attracts partners who are dependent, who need to be taken care of, because this allows him to maintain his strong persona while vicariously experiencing care through caring for them. But he remains fundamentally isolated, unable to receive, unable to allow himself to be seen in his wholeness. He projects his shadow onto others, seeing dependency as weakness, viewing people who ask for help as pathetic or inadequate. He is encountering his own disowned vulnerability in them, and he rejects it. Over time, this rigid persona may become unsustainable. Perhaps a crisis occurs that breaks through his defenses, an illness or loss or failure that he cannot handle alone. Perhaps his relationships collapse because the lack of genuine vulnerability has made real intimacy impossible. Perhaps he simply becomes exhausted from the constant performance of strength. And in this breakdown, there is again the possibility of recognizing the persona for what it is, of seeing that it is not his true self, but a protective construction that has become a prison. These examples illustrate a fundamental principle. The persona becomes pathological when we identify with it completely, when we believe it is who we actually are. When this happens, we lose contact with our authentic self, with the deeper center of the psyche that exists beneath all roles and performances. We become hollow, performing our character rather than living our life. We relate to others from behind a mask, and we never experience the intimacy and connection that come from being truly seen and truly known. Now, let us speak about the process through which the persona is maintained. It is maintained through psychological defenses, through mechanisms that keep the shadow material unconscious and preserve the identification with the persona. The primary defense is denial. We simply do not see the aspects of ourselves that contradict the persona. When we behave in ways that do not fit our self-concept, we rationalize, we make excuses, we reinterpret the behavior to fit the persona rather than questioning the persona itself. The woman who prides herself on selflessness will not recognize her own resentment even when it is obvious to everyone around her. She will explain her passive-aggressive behavior as simply being tired or forgetful. She will interpret her criticism of others as caring concern rather than projection. The man who prides himself on strength will not acknowledge his loneliness even when it is consuming him. He will interpret his inability to connect as a preference for solitude rather than as a defense against vulnerability. The denial is so complete that the person genuinely does not see what is right in front of them. Another defense is repression. When feelings or impulses arise that threaten the persona, they are immediately pushed down, forced out of consciousness before they can be fully registered. This happens automatically and unconsciously. The helpful woman feels a flash of anger when someone asks for her help, but the feeling is repressed so quickly that she is not even aware it occurred. The strong man feels a wave of fear or sadness, but it is suppressed before it reaches consciousness. Over time, this repression becomes so habitual that the person loses the capacity to feel these emotions at all. They are not consciously suppressing them. The suppression has become unconscious, automatic, part of the structure of the psyche. A third defense is projection, which I have already mentioned. We see in others what we cannot see in ourselves. The persona creates a kind of blindness to certain aspects of our own being, but we can still perceive these aspects when they appear in other people. And when we do, we react strongly, with judgment, criticism, disgust, or fascination. These strong reactions are indicators that we are encountering our shadow, that we are seeing in the other person something we have disowned in ourselves. Understanding projection is crucial to recognizing the persona, because our projections reveal what is hidden in the shadow. If we pay attention to the qualities in others that disturb us disproportionately, if we examine what we judge most harshly, we will find aspects of our own shadow. The person who is most critical of others' selfishness is likely suppressing their own selfish desires. The person who is most judgmental of others' weakness is likely denying their own vulnerability. The person who is most disturbed by others' anger is likely repressing their own rage. A fourth defense mechanism is rationalization. This is the process by which we create logical explanations for behaviors or feelings that actually arise from unconscious motivations. The persona uses rationalization to justify actions that contradict the self-image, reframing them in ways that preserve the identification. The generous person who secretly enjoys the power that comes from being needed will rationalize their caretaking as pure altruism. The strong person who maintains distance in relationships will rationalize their isolation as a preference for independence rather than as a fear of intimacy. These rationalizations are convincing because they contain partial truths, but they obscure the deeper psychological dynamics at work. A fifth defense is compartmentalization. This is the capacity to keep contradictory aspects of ourselves separated so that they never have to be integrated or acknowledged simultaneously. A person might have a professional persona that is calm and controlled, and a private life where they act out in ways that completely contradict this image. But they keep these two domains so separate that they never have to confront the contradiction. The person who is scrupulously honest in business might lie habitually in personal relationships. The person who is gentle and kind at home might be ruthless and aggressive at work. The compartmentalization allows both aspects to exist without ever challenging the dominant persona. Now, we must ask, what is the cost of living behind a persona we do not recognize as a mask? The cost is authenticity. When we identify with the persona, we cannot be genuine because we are constantly performing a role rather than expressing our actual being. We are always monitoring ourselves, making sure we conform to the image, suppressing anything that does not fit. This creates a kind of inner surveillance, a constant self-censorship that is exhausting and alienating. The cost is also vitality. The energy that is used to maintain the persona, to keep the shadow repressed, to sustain the split between acceptable and unacceptable self, is enormous. This is why people who are rigidly identified with their persona often feel depleted, flat, going through the motions of life without genuine engagement. The life force is being channeled into maintaining the mask rather than being available for living. They wake up tired. They go through their days with a sense of emptiness. They feel disconnected from themselves and from life itself. Another cost is relationship. When we relate to others from behind a persona, we never form truly intimate connections. Intimacy requires vulnerability, requires showing ourselves as we actually are, including the parts we judge as unacceptable. But the person identified with the persona cannot do this. They can only show the mask, the approved version of themselves, and so they remain fundamentally alone, surrounded by people who know the persona but not the person. They may have many acquaintances but no real friends. They may be in relationships but experience no genuine closeness. There is always a wall, always a distance, always a performance. The cost is also psychological symptoms. When the shadow is completely repressed, when it is given no conscious expression, it expresses itself unconsciously through symptoms. Depression, anxiety, psychosomatic illness, compulsive behaviors, addictions, all of these can be manifestations of the disowned self-demanding acknowledgement. The symptoms are the shadow's way of breaking through the persona, of forcing the person to pay attention to what has been denied. The body develops chronic pain that has no medical explanation. The mind becomes anxious without apparent cause. The person develops obsessive thoughts or compulsive rituals that seem irrational, but are symbolically expressing what cannot be consciously acknowledged. And finally, the cost is the loss of the self. The self, in the depth psychological sense, is the totality of the psyche, the center and circumference, the unity that encompasses both conscious and unconscious. When we identify with the persona, we lose contact with this deeper self. We mistake the surface for the depth. We become fragmented, living in only a small portion of our being, cut off from the wellspring of creativity, meaning, and wholeness that resides in the deeper layers of the psyche. We lose access to our dreams, to our intuitions, to the symbolic and imaginative dimensions of experience. We become literal, concrete, one-dimensional. The path toward wholeness, toward individuation, requires that we recognize the persona as a mask and distinguish it from our actual self. This recognition usually comes through crisis, through experiences that shatter the persona's pretense of completeness. Perhaps a life transition forces us to question our identity. The successful professional is forced to retire and discovers they have no sense of who they are without their work role. The devoted parent watches their children leave home and realizes they have no identity apart from being a caregiver. The strong person faces a crisis they cannot handle and is forced to acknowledge their vulnerability. Perhaps a breakdown reveals that we are not who we thought we were. The calm person has a panic attack that terrifies them. The rational person is overwhelmed by emotions they cannot control. The independent person finds themselves desperately needing help. These experiences rupture the persona and reveal what lies beneath. Perhaps someone close to us confronts us with aspects of ourselves we have been blind to. A partner says, "You claim to be easygoing, but you are actually quite controlling." A friend says, "You present yourself as confident, but I see your insecurity." A colleague says, "You say you do not care what others think, but you are constantly seeking approval." These confrontations can be devastating because they challenge the entire structure of our self-understanding. But they can also be liberating if we are willing to consider that they might be true. Perhaps we simply become aware of the gap between how we present ourselves and how we actually feel inside. We notice that we are performing, that we are saying things we do not mean, that we are smiling when we are actually unhappy, that we are projecting an image that has become exhausting to maintain. This awareness can arise spontaneously, perhaps in a moment of quiet reflection, perhaps through therapy or analysis, perhaps through a practice like meditation that creates space for self-observation. This recognition is painful because the persona has provided safety and structure. It has defined who we are in the world. It has earned us approval and success. To question it feels like questioning everything. But the recognition is also liberating because it is the first step toward authenticity, toward living from a deeper place than the mask allows. Once we recognize the persona, the work becomes to explore what lies beneath it, to investigate the shadow. This requires a kind of fearless self-examination. We must be willing to see aspects of ourselves that we have judged as unacceptable. We must be willing to feel emotions we have spent years suppressing. We must be willing to acknowledge needs and desires we have denied. We must be willing to admit that we are more complex, more contradictory, more human than the persona allows. This exploration is not about judging ourselves harshly or wallowing in self-criticism. It is about honesty, about seeing what is actually there rather than what we wish were there. It is about recognizing that the qualities in the shadow are not necessarily bad. They may be qualities that were inappropriately rejected, qualities that are actually necessary for wholeness. The person who has suppressed all anger needs to reclaim healthy anger for self-protection. The person who has suppressed all need needs to reclaim the capacity to depend on others. The person who has suppressed all selfishness needs to reclaim healthy self-care. The person who has suppressed all playfulness needs to reclaim spontaneity and joy. As we explore the shadow and begin to integrate what we find there, the persona naturally becomes more flexible, more transparent. We no longer need to maintain it so rigidly because we are no longer terrified of what lies beneath it. We can allow more of ourselves to be visible, to be expressed, to be lived. We can inhabit our roles in the world without being imprisoned by them. We can be professional when professionalism is needed, but we are not only professional. We can be generous when generosity is appropriate, but we are not only generous. We can be strong when strength is required, but we are not only strong. This flexibility, this capacity to move fluidly between different aspects of ourselves without identifying completely with any single role, is a mark of psychological maturity. It is the fruit of the individuation process, the journey toward becoming a whole person rather than a collection of masks. And this wholeness brings a kind of freedom that is impossible when we are identified with the persona. It is the freedom to be who we actually are, in all our complexity and contradiction, rather than who we think we should be. Let me speak now about the archetype that underlies the persona, because the persona is not simply a personal construction. It is also connected to archetypal patterns, to universal structures of human psychology. Every culture has roles, has expectations about how people should behave in different contexts. These roles are archetypal. They exist before any individual encounters them, and they shape how we construct our personas. The archetypal roles include the hero, the caregiver, the sage, the rebel, the innocent, the ruler, and many others. We gravitate towards certain archetypal roles based on our early experiences, our innate tendencies, and our cultural context, and we construct our persona around these archetypal patterns. The person who identifies with the hero persona sees themselves as strong, courageous, capable of overcoming obstacles. The person who identifies with the caregiver persona sees themselves as nurturing, selfless, devoted to others. The person who identifies with the sage persona sees themselves as wise, detached, above emotional entanglements. These archetypal personas are powerful because they tap into collective patterns that are larger than the individual. They give us a sense of meaning and purpose. They connect us to something universal. But they also trap us if we identify with them too completely, if we believe that the archetype is who we are rather than a pattern we are temporarily embodying. The hero persona, for instance, requires that we deny vulnerability, fear, the need for rest or support. The person identified with this archetype must always be overcoming, always conquering, always proving their strength. They cannot admit weakness without threatening their entire identity. And this creates enormous psychological strain because no one can maintain the heroic stance indefinitely. Eventually, the hero burns out, collapses, or becomes the tyrant, using their strength to dominate rather than to serve. The caregiver persona requires that we deny our own needs, our own desires for care and attention. The person identified with this archetype must always be giving, always nurturing, always putting others first. They cannot receive without guilt. They cannot prioritize themselves without feeling selfish. And this creates a slow depletion, a gradual erosion of self, until eventually they have nothing left to give and they collapse into resentment or illness. The sage persona requires that we deny our emotions, our body, our engagement with the messy reality of human life. The person identified with this archetype must always be detached, always observing, always above it all. They cannot be passionate or involved without feeling they are losing their wisdom. And this creates a kind of lifelessness, a disconnection from vitality and meaning, until eventually they realize that wisdom without engagement is empty. The work of individuation involves recognizing these archetypal patterns without being possessed by them. It involves seeing that we can draw on the energy of the hero when heroism is needed. But we are not only the hero. We can embody the caregiver when caring is appropriate, but we are not only the caregiver. We are something larger than any archetype, something that can engage with different archetypal energies as the situation requires while remaining rooted in our individual being. This requires developing what we might call a relationship with the archetypes rather than an identification with them. We can work with the hero energy when we need courage and strength, but we can also set it aside when vulnerability and rest are needed. We can access the caregiver energy when nurturing is appropriate, but we can also access other energies when self-care or assertion is required. We become conscious participants in archetypal patterns rather than unconscious embodiments of them. As we come toward the end of this reflection, I want to emphasize that the recognition of the persona is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning. It is the first step toward living more authentically, more fully, more consciously. The persona will not disappear, nor should it. We need the capacity to adapt, to present ourselves appropriately in different contexts. But we need to know that we are adapting, that we are choosing how to present ourselves rather than being unconsciously driven by a mask we do not recognize. The ongoing work is to remain aware of the gap between the persona and the deeper self, to continue exploring the shadow, to integrate what we find there, and to live increasingly from the center rather than from the surface. This is difficult work. It requires constant vigilance, constant honesty, constant willingness to see ourselves as we actually are. But it is also the most rewarding work we can do because it leads to a life that is genuinely ours, a life that is lived rather than performed. The person who has done this work begins to live differently. They are less concerned with how they appear to others and more concerned with whether they are being authentic. They are less defensive when confronted with aspects of themselves they have not seen because they know that there is always more to discover. They are less judgmental of others because they have recognized their own complexity and contradiction. They are more present in relationships because they are no longer maintaining a performance. They are more vital because their energy is available for living rather than being consumed by the maintenance of the mask. This does not mean they become reckless or inappropriate. It means they make conscious choices about how to present themselves rather than being unconsciously driven by the persona. They can still be professional in professional contexts, but they know they are choosing to be professional rather than believing that professional is what they are. They can still be polite in social situations, but they know they are choosing politeness rather than identifying with being a polite person. The difference is subtle but profound. It is the difference between conscious adaptation and unconscious identification. If this exploration has revealed something about the masks you wear, if you recognize the persona operating in your own life, I invite you to support this channel by liking this video and subscribing to Psyche and Meaning. This work exists for those who are willing to question themselves deeply, who understand that the path to meaning runs through self-knowledge, who are ready to look beneath the surface of their own presentation. Your engagement helps this content reach others who are ready for this confrontation with the persona. And so we return to the beginning. You are wearing a psychological mask, a persona that mediates between your inner world and outer reality. And the most dangerous aspect of this mask is that you do not know you are wearing it. You have identified with it so completely that you believe it is your face, that the role you play is who you actually are. But it is not. Beneath the mask is a deeper reality, a fuller self, a complexity that cannot be contained in any single role or image. The invitation is to recognize the mask, to see it for what it is, a necessary adaptation, but not the totality of who you are. The invitation is to explore what lies beneath the persona, to reclaim the shadow, to integrate the rejected parts, to become acquainted with your actual depth rather than living only on the surface. This is the path of individuation. This is the journey toward wholeness. And though it is difficult, though it requires dismantling the very structures that have given you identity and security, it is the only path to an authentic life. The mask you wear is not your face. It is time to discover what lies beneath it. The work begins with a simple question: who am I when I am not performing?